So younger people tend to just die less on average. They tend to be healthier and have underlying mortality that's lower. But that is about doubled for a really hot day, and for old people, it's also about doubled, right? And we think the reason that you see similar relative risk, which is not something that's been documented in kind of labs before, is that they're like the real world is more complicated than the lab um, for a few reasons. This is why we think it's important to use real world data. Probably younger people have higher activity levels. They're more exposed to heat in outdoor occupations. Very young people, like infants, just have trouble regulating their core temperature. They have reduced sweating efficiency, things like that. So there are a lot of kind of real world reasons why you might expect that this all else equal claim that you observe in a lab doesn't hold in the real world. And so that's kind of the second piece that's driving this. And then the third piece is just that, and this is a fine point, but I think very important to understand that the temperature at which your kind of additional mortality risk from ambient weather is lowest is just way higher for elderly people. So you see all these kind of U-shaped relationships where like extreme heat and extreme cold are both bad for health. The bottom of that U is just at a really high point for elderly people. I think this is kind of intuitive. Like my grandma is 97. She likes her house to be very warm. She's very vulnerable to cold. She has trouble warming her body up. She has trouble staying warm. Um, in the US, elderly people like to move to places that don't really have winters, right? They're moving to Arizona, they're moving to Florida, really hot places. And so on a day that you might describe as pretty warm or kind of hot, they're actually doing really well. Their mortality risk is minimized on those days. By contrast, the youngest people on those days are already suffering quite a bit. So their mortality risk is minimized kind of like 10 degrees Celsius lower in wet bulb terms. And that's a huge distance. So there's the vast majority of exposures, just the vast majority of days are in that range. And so if for most days your risk is low, which would be true for elderly people, then on a kind of absolute basis, you're just going to have much less vulnerability because you have much less exposure to the kinds of temperatures that hurt you. For a given extreme day, the elderly are still disproportionately vulnerable, right? But for the days that we actually see in the real world, those extreme days are really rare. The kind of moderately hot days are really common. And so if you're experiencing vulnerability to heat on those days for any number of reasons, then those just accumulate to be a much larger total risk.
And is any of this surprising to you? Any of your initial findings? Did you check
Yeah.
for them?
So I think each individual piece is not maybe surprising when you hear it. Like, I think if you speak to epidemiologists or medical professionals about each individual claim made here that younger groups tend to be more numerous in these contexts, that for social reasons they might have vulnerability at lower temperatures, that the temperature where their mortality risk is minimized happens to be lower. Each of those individual claims, I think, is not particularly surprising. But when you put them together and you can make this claim that, like, for heat, the young are disproportionately vulnerable, that is kind of a surprising claim. I think that's what people are keying in on, that these pieces haven't been brought together in a real world setting before in a way that makes this so apparent. And so it might shift how we think about prioritizing resources or informing people about the relative risks that different age groups face from kind of ambient weather conditions.